The sun creeps through your small window just like every other morning. But today feels different. You stretch your arms and yawn, not knowing that you just woke up in 1347, the worst possible year to be a blacksmith. Outside, birds are singing, and people are starting their day. Your village looks peaceful, quiet, normal. But if you could see into the future, you'd pack your things and run as far as you could, because in just a few months, everything you know will change forever. Your name is Thomas, and you're 17 years old. Your hands are already rough from years of working with hot metal and heavy hammers. Your father taught you everything. He knows about making horseshoes, kitchen knives, and farm tools. Your grandfather was a blacksmith too, and his father before him. It's in your blood, this love for turning raw metal into something useful. Every morning you wake up excited to work with fire and iron. You love the sound of the hammer hitting, the anvil, the way the metal glows orange in the darkness of the forge. But today, something feels strange. When you walk down to the workshop, your father is standing over a pile of new iron ore. He's frowning, which is weird because he usually smiles when new materials arrive. This iron looks different, darker than usual, with a strange shimmer that makes your eyes water if you look at it too long. "Where did this come from?" you ask. Your father shakes his head slowly. "A merchant brought it yesterday evening. Strangest fellow I've ever seen. Wouldn't show his face, spoke in whispers, and left before I could ask him any questions." You pick up a piece of the strange iron ore and immediately drop it. It's ice cold, even though it's been sitting near the warm forge all night. Your father notices your reaction and nods grimly. "I had the same feeling when I touched it. But it was cheap, son. Cheaper than any iron I've ever bought. And we need all the materials we can get if we want to keep food on the table. You understand, times have been hard lately, and your family can't afford to be picky about where their materials come from. Still, something deep in your gut tells you this iron is going to bring trouble. The village is waking up around you. You hear Mrs. Elena calling to her chickens, old Henrik coughing as he opens his bakery, and the sound of horses pulling carts down the main road. Everything seems normal, but you can't shake the feeling that you're living in the calm before a terrible storm. Your father starts heating the forge, and soon the familiar orange glow fills the workshop. "Come on, Thomas," he says, handing you your hammer. "Let's see what this new iron can do." As you take the hammer, you don't realize that you're about to create something that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. You've always loved being a blacksmith. There's something magical about taking a cold, hard piece of metal and turning it into something useful. A horseshoe that will carry someone to safety, a knife that will feed a family, a lock that will protect someone's home. You feel proud when farmers come to buy your tools, when merchants praise your work, when travelers ask for your services. In most years, being a blacksmith would be the perfect job. You'd live a good life, maybe have a family of your own, and pass your skills to your children. But this isn't most years. This is 1347, and you're about to learn that sometimes the thing you love most can become your biggest nightmare. The first customer arrives just as you're getting the forge hot enough to work. It's Sir Marcus, a knight, who lives in the big house on the hill. He's always been kind to your family, but today he looks worried. His horse is restless, and he keeps looking over his shoulder as if someone is following him. "Thomas, my boy," he says, his voice tight with anxiety. "I need you to make me 50 arrow points, good ones, sharp ones, and I need them fast." 50 arrow points is a lot of work, but Sir Marcus pays well. Your father nods and quotes a price. Sir Marcus doesn't even try to bargain. He just pulls out a heavy purse and counts out the coins. "How quickly can you have them ready?" he asks. 3 days, your father replies. "Make it 2, Sir Marcus says, dropping extra coins on the counter. "And use your best iron." As Sir Marcus rides away, you and your father exchange worried glances. Knights don't order 50 arrow points unless they're expecting trouble. Big trouble. Your father picks up a piece of the strange dark iron and examines it carefully. "Well, son," he says with a sigh, "I guess we'll find out what this mysterious metal can do. Let's hope it makes good arrow points." You nod and start pumping the bellows to make the fire hotter. The iron glows as it heats up, but instead of the usual bright orange, it turns a deep, dark red that reminds you of dried blood. You try to ignore the chill that runs down your spine as you begin to work. You were only 10 years old when your father first put a hammer in your hands. It was smaller than his, made specially for a child, but it felt heavy and important. Today, you become a real blacksmith, he said with a smile that made you feel proud and scared at the same time. The workshop was dark except for the orange glow of the forge, and the heat hit your face like a warm blanket. Your father showed you how to hold the hammer, how to strike the metal at just the right angle, how to turn the iron while it was still hot and soft. Remember, Thomas, he said, the metal is alive when it's hot. It wants to be shaped. You just have to listen to what it's telling you. That first day, you made a simple nail. It took you 2 hours to make something your father could create in 5 minutes. But when you held up that crooked, slightly too thick nail, you felt like you had created magic. Your mother hung it on the kitchen wall and told everyone who visited about her son's first piece of metalwork. You went to bed that night with blisters on your hands and soot on your face, but you were happier than you'd ever been. You dreamed of making swords for knights, beautiful jewelry for ladies, and tools that would help feed the whole village. You had no idea that metalwork could be anything but wonderful. The years passed quickly after that. Every morning, you'd wake up before dawn and help your father prepare the forge. You learned to read the color of the metal. Bright orange meant it was ready to shape. Dark red meant it needed more heat. And white hot meant you had to be very, very careful. You learned which tools to use for different jobs, how to make the fire burn hotter or cooler, and how to tell when a piece was finished. Your hands grew strong and steady, your arms thick with muscle. By the time you were 15, you could make a horseshoe almost as well as your father. By 16, customers were asking specifically for your work. But something changed when that strange iron ore arrived at your workshop. The very first time you heated a piece of it, something felt wrong. The metal didn't behave the way iron should. Instead of glowing bright orange, it turned that deep, blood-red color that made your stomach twist. When you struck it with your hammer, it didn't ring with the clear, bright sound of good iron. Instead, it made a dull, hollow noise that seemed to echo in your chest. And the sparks, the sparks were all wrong. Instead of flying up toward the ceiling like tiny stars, they fell down toward the floor like drops of liquid fire. Your father noticed it too, but he didn't say anything at first. He just watched you work with a worried expression on his face. Finally, after you'd been struggling with the strange iron for an hour, he came over and examined your work. The arrow point you'd been making looked perfect. Sharp, balanced, exactly what Sir Marcus had ordered. But when your father picked it up, he immediately set it back down and wiped his hands on his apron. "Did you feel that?" he asked quietly. You nodded. The metal had felt cold, even though it had just come out of the fire. Not just cool, ice cold, like touching snow in winter. You tried to ignore the feeling and kept working. After all, you had a job to do, and Sir Marcus was paying good money for these arrow points. But with each piece you made from the strange iron, the feeling got worse. Your hands started to ache, not from the work, but from something else. A deep, throbbing pain that seemed to come from inside your bones. The workshop, which had always felt warm and cozy, began to feel cold and unwelcoming. Even the familiar sound of hammering on anvil started to sound different, more like a funeral bell than the cheerful rhythm of honest work. By the end of that first day, working with the mysterious iron, you were exhausted in a way you'd never been before. Usually, a hard day's work left you tired but satisfied. Today, you felt drained, hollow, like something important had been sucked out of you. Your father looked the same way, pale and worried, rubbing his hands together as if he couldn't get them warm. "Tomorrow we'll finish Sir Marcus's order," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Then maybe we can go back to using our regular iron." You nodded, hoping he was right, but deep down you had a feeling that things would never go back to normal. That night, you had the strangest dreams. You saw yourself in the workshop, but everything was different. The forge burned with a cold blue flame instead of warm orange fire. The iron you worked with moved and twisted on its own, like it was alive and angry. And in the corner of the workshop, you saw a figure watching you, tall, dressed in a dark cloak with eyes that glowed like hot coals. Every time you tried to look directly at the figure, it would fade away, but you could always feel it watching you. When you woke up, your sheets were soaked with sweat, and your hands ached as if you'd been working all night. The next morning, you told your father about the dreams, but he just shook his head and said, "Bad iron makes for bad dreams, son. Once we finish this order and get back to our regular materials, everything will be fine." But even as he said it, you could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe it any more than you did. Still, you both went back to work, because what else could you do? You had a reputation to maintain, a family to feed, and a customer waiting for his order. You picked up your hammer and got back to work, not knowing that each strike was bringing you closer to a nightmare that would change your life forever. 3 days after you finished Sir Marcus's arrow points, a stranger appeared at your workshop door. It was late afternoon, and you were cleaning up after a long day of shoeing horses for the local farmers. The man was tall and thin, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak that covered most of his face. He didn't knock or call out like normal customers do. He just stood there in the doorway, silent as a shadow, waiting for you to notice him. When you finally looked up from organizing your tools, you jumped so hard you nearly dropped the hammer you were holding. "Can I help you?" you asked, your voice cracking a little. The stranger stepped into your workshop without being invited. His boots made no sound on the stone floor, which was strange because everyone's boots made noise in your workshop. He looked around slowly, examining your forge, your anvil, your tools, like he was taking inventory of everything you owned. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was so quiet you had to strain to hear him. "I need weapons," he said simply. "Spear points, 50 of them, sharp enough to pierce armor, light enough to fly true." Your father appeared from the back room where he'd been sorting iron, and you saw his face go pale when he saw the stranger. 50 spear points is a big order," your father said carefully. "That's a lot of work, and good iron isn't cheap these days." The stranger reached into his cloak and pulled out a leather pouch. When he opened it, you gasped. Inside were more gold coins than you'd ever seen in one place. Real gold, not the silver and copper coins most people paid with. The stranger counted out 20 gold pieces and placed them on your workbench. "This is half," he said. "You'll get the other half when the work is done, but I need them in 3 days. Your father's eyes widened. 20 gold coins was more money than your family usually made in 6 months. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. The stranger never removed his hood, never showed his face properly. His hands, when he counted out the coins, were pale and thin, with long fingernails that looked more like claws. And the coins themselves, when you picked one up to examine, it felt burning hot, like it had just come out of the forge. You dropped it quickly, and it clattered on the floor with a sound that seemed too loud, too sharp. The stranger watched you with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light of the workshop. "Is there a problem?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made your blood run cold. "No problem at all," your father said quickly, shooting you a warning look. 3 days, you said. "We can do that, but we'll need to use our best iron, and that means working day and night." The stranger nodded slowly. "Use whatever iron you need, but make sure the points are perfect. They must be sharp enough to cut through anything, strong enough to never break, and—" He paused, and you saw his lips curve into what might have been a smile. "They must be made with passion, with fire in your heart. Do you understand?" Your father nodded, though you could see he didn't understand at all. Neither did you, but that pouch of gold was too tempting to refuse. After the stranger left, you and your father stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, your father picked up the leather pouch and hefted it in his hands. "This is enough money to buy new tools, repair the roof, and feed us for a year," he said quietly. "We can't turn down work like this." But even as he said it, you could hear the doubt in his voice. You picked up one of the gold coins again, and this time you were ready for the heat. It was like holding a piece of the sun. So hot it almost burned your fingers, but somehow it didn't actually hurt. Just felt wrong. Like the coin wasn't quite what it appeared to be. "Father," you said slowly, "what kind of person pays in gold that burns? And why does he need 50 spear points in 3 days? That's enough weapons to arm a small army." Your father was quiet for a long time, staring at the coins. Finally, he sighed and put the pouch away in his strongbox. "I don't know, son. But in times like these, we can't afford to ask too many questions. Maybe he's a merchant who buys weapons to sell in other towns. Maybe he's a collector. Maybe he's just a rich man who likes to pay in gold. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we have work, and we're being paid well for it." But that night, as you lay in bed trying to fall asleep, you couldn't stop thinking about the stranger. There was something about him that reminded you of the stories your grandmother used to tell. Tales of dark creatures that walked among humans, offering gifts that came with terrible prices. You thought about his pale hands, his glowing eyes, his voice that seemed to echo even when he whispered. And you thought about those burning gold coins. In all the stories you'd heard, creatures like that never paid for anything without expecting something much more valuable in return. But what could a simple blacksmith possibly have that such a being would want? The next morning, you and your father started work on the spear points. You decided to use the strange dark iron that had been sitting in your workshop for weeks. After all, the stranger had said to use your best materials, and this iron, whatever it was, seemed to make the strongest, sharpest weapons you'd ever created. But as soon as you started heating the first piece, you knew you'd made a mistake. The metal didn't just turn that strange blood-red color. It seemed to pulse and writhe in the flames like it was alive. And when you shaped it into a spear point, it came out perfect. Too perfect. Sharp enough to cut through anything, just like the stranger had requested. Sharp enough to cut through armor, through bone, through anything that stood in its way. As you worked through that first day, making spear point after spear point, you began to notice something strange. Each weapon you finished seemed to whisper to you. Not with words you could hear, but with feelings, with images that appeared in your mind. Images of battle, of blood, of people screaming and running. You tried to ignore these visions, telling yourself it was just your imagination, but they got stronger with each spear point you completed. By the end of the day, you had made 15 perfect weapons, and you felt like you'd lived through a dozen wars. Your father looked just as troubled as you felt, but neither of you said anything. You just locked the finished spear points away, and tried to forget about the whispers that seemed to follow you even after you left the workshop. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came exactly 1 week after you delivered the spear points to the mysterious stranger. Old Henrik, the baker who had bought a new set of kitchen knives from you just days before, didn't open his shop that morning. This was strange because Henrik had never missed a day of work in the 20 years you'd known him. His bread was famous throughout the village, and people came from neighboring towns just to buy his sweet rolls and honey cakes. When concerned neighbors broke down his door, they found him in his bed, burning with fever and covered in strange black spots that looked like drops of ink scattered across his skin. Within 2 days, Henrik was dead. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened to everyone who had touched the knives you made for him. His assistant, young Peter, who had used the knives to cut bread for customers. His wife, Martha, who had washed them after each day's work. Even some of the regular customers who had handled the knives while examining Henrik's fine work. One by one, they all fell ill with the same burning fever, the same terrible black spots. And one by one, they began to die. The village doctor had never seen anything like it. He called it the Black Death and warned everyone to stay away from the sick. But it was already too late. You tried to tell yourself it was just a coincidence. People got sick all the time, especially in winter when the cold winds brought illness from other towns. But deep in your heart, you knew better. Every person who fell ill had one thing in common. They had all touched something you had made with that strange dark iron. Mrs. Elena, who bought new horseshoes for her old mare. The miller, who needed new gears for his grinding wheel. Even Sir Marcus, who had used your arrow points for hunting, came down with the fever. You watched from your workshop window as more and more houses in the village began to show the telltale signs of sickness. Doors marked with red crosses, families weeping in the streets, the sound of church bells ringing constantly for the dead. Your father noticed the pattern too, but he refused to believe it at first. Iron can't make people sick, Thomas, he said, but his voice shook as he spoke. We've been working with metal our whole lives, and we've never hurt anyone. It's just bad luck, son. These things happen. But even as he tried to convince you, you could see the doubt growing in his eyes. He started examining every piece of work you'd done with the cursed iron, checking and rechecking for some sign, some clue that might explain what was happening. His hands trembled as he handled the weapons and tools, and you noticed he started, wearing thick leather gloves even when the metal was cold. The breakthrough came when you decided to test your theory. You took a small piece of the strange iron and heated it in the forge, then shaped it into a simple nail. Just one nail, nothing special about it except that it was made from the cursed metal. You gave it to a stray dog that often hung around your workshop, hiding it in a piece of bread. The dog wagged its tail happily as it ate, but within hours it was lying on its side, panting heavily. By the next morning the dog was dead, and its fur was matted with the same black spots that had appeared on Henrik and the others. That's when you knew for certain the iron itself was cursed, poisoned, evil. Everything you had made with it was spreading death throughout your village. Panic set in when you realized how much of the cursed iron you had already used. Dozens of tools, weapons, horseshoes, nails, kitchen implements, all of them were out. There in the village, in people's homes, being touched and used by innocent families. You and your father spent 3 sleepless nights trying to remember everyone who had bought something from your workshop in the past month. The list was terrifyingly long. The blacksmith, who had always been seen as a protector and helper of the community, had become its greatest threat. You had brought death to your own neighbors, your own friends, without even knowing it. You wanted to run through the village, warning everyone, collecting all the cursed items, destroying them before they could hurt anyone else. But your father stopped you. Think, Thomas, he said grimly. What happens when people find out that we're the ones who brought this plague to their homes? They'll hang us both before sunset. And even if they don't, who's going to believe that? Iron can be cursed. They'll think we're making excuses, trying to escape blame for poisoning half the village. He was right, of course. In a time when people believed in witches and demons, a blacksmith who claimed his iron was cursed would be seen as either crazy or evil. Maybe both. So you did the only thing you could do. You tried to help the sick in secret. You and your father began visiting the afflicted families at night, bringing food and medicine, trying to ease their suffering without revealing your connection to their illness. It was heartbreaking work. You watched children burn with fever, saw strong men waste away to nothing, held the hands of dying women who whispered prayers through cracked, blackened lips. Every person you tried to help was someone you had unknowingly hurt. The guilt was like a physical weight on your chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to think about anything except the terrible mistake you had made. The village was dying, and it was your fault. The once busy market square stood empty except for the occasional funeral procession. Shops remained closed, their owners either dead or too sick to work. Children no longer played in the streets, and the few healthy people left avoided each other, afraid that any contact might spread the mysterious illness. The church bell, which used to ring joyfully for weddings and celebrations, now tolled constantly for the dead. Father Miguel, the village priest, held mass grave ceremonies because there weren't enough healthy people left to dig individual graves. And through it all, you and your father continued your secret work, trying to atone for the disaster you had unleashed, knowing that no amount of good deeds could bring back the dead or undo the curse of the strange iron ore. The weight of your guilt grew heavier each day. You began to have nightmares where the dead villagers visited you, asking why you had killed them, why you had brought such suffering to people who had trusted you. You saw Henrik's wife, Martha, holding the cursed knife that had ended her life. You saw the stray dog, still wagging its tail even as black spots spread across its fur. You saw children reaching out to you with small hands covered in the same dark marks that had marked them for death. And always, in the background of these dreams, you heard the sound of hammering, your own hammer, striking cursed iron, creating death with every blow. You woke up screaming, your hands cramped as if you'd been gripping your tools all night, and you knew that things were about to get much, much worse. 2 weeks after the plague began spreading through your village, a group of soldiers arrived at your workshop. They wore the colors of the regional lord, and their leader carried an official document with a heavy wax seal. Your heart sank when you saw them because you knew they weren't bringing good news. The captain, a stern man with grey hair and cold eyes, unrolled the document and read it aloud in a voice that carried no emotion. By order of Lord Edmund, all blacksmiths in the region are hereby commanded to serve the crown in these dark times. You will produce the items requested by his lordship's representatives, and failure to comply will be considered treason against the realm. What they wanted made your blood run cold. Chains. Heavy iron chains, thick shackles, and cage-like contraptions that could hold a person prisoner. We need enough restraints to secure 200 suspected plague carriers, the captain explained, matter-of-factly. The Lord has decided that the only way to stop this sickness from spreading is to lock up anyone who shows symptoms. Can't have sick people wandering around infecting the healthy ones. You wanted to scream that locking up sick people wouldn't help, that the real problem was the cursed iron you'd unknowingly used to make tools and weapons. But you couldn't say that without confessing your role in the disaster. Your father tried to refuse the order. "Captain," he said respectfully, "we're just village blacksmiths. We make horseshoes and kitchen knives, not prison equipment." Surely there are other smiths better suited for such work. The captain's expression didn't change. "There were other smiths," he said quietly. "Most of them are dead now, killed by this plague. You and your son are the only skilled metalworkers left in this region. And according to our records, you've produced some of the finest weapons and tools anyone has seen. That makes you essential to the Crown's efforts to contain this outbreak." The irony was bitter as poison. Your skill as a blacksmith, the thing you'd always been most proud of, had become a trap. You were too good at your job to be allowed to quit, too valuable to the authorities to be left alone. And the very skill that had made you famous was the same skill that had allowed you to create such effective cursed weapons and tools in the first place. If you had been a mediocre blacksmith, maybe the cursed iron wouldn't have worked so well. Maybe fewer people would have been infected. Maybe you could have disappeared into the crowd of ordinary craftsmen and escaped notice. But no, you had to be the best, and now that skill was going to force you to create instruments of suffering for your own neighbors. The soldiers made it clear that you had no choice in the matter. They set up a camp around your workshop, posting guards at every entrance and exit. "For your protection," the captain explained, "but you knew better. They were there to make sure you couldn't run away, couldn't refuse to work, couldn't do anything except follow orders. Your workshop, which had always been a place of creativity and pride, became a prison. The familiar sounds of hammer on anvil took on a different meaning when you knew that every strike was creating tools to imprison innocent people who were sick through no fault of their own. The first batch of chains and shackles was the hardest to make. Your hands shook as you shaped the iron links, knowing that soon these restraints would be wrapped around the wrists and ankles of your neighbors. Mrs. Elena, who was showing early signs of the fever. Young Peter, who had helped Henrik in the bakery before falling ill. Even some children whose only crime was touching a cursed tool you had made. With every chain link you forged, you imagined the faces of the people who would wear them. You tried to make the shackles loose, weak, easy to escape from, but the soldiers inspected every piece carefully and rejected anything that wasn't perfect. Your father handled the situation even worse than you did. He had always taken pride in making things that helped people, tools for farmers, shoes for horses, weapons for protection. Now he was being forced to create instruments of captivity, and it was destroying him from the inside. You watched him grow thinner and paler with each passing day, his hands moving mechanically as he worked, but his eyes empty of their usual spark. He stopped eating regularly, stopped talking except when absolutely necessary, and began muttering prayers under his breath as he worked. Sometimes you caught him staring at his hands as if he couldn't believe what they were being forced to create. The worst part was seeing the results of your work. Every few days, the soldiers would load up carts with the chains and shackles you'd made and drive them into the village. Hours later, you'd hear screaming and crying as families were torn apart, as sick people were dragged from their homes and locked away in hastily built detention centers. You knew that some of these people were genuinely ill with the plague, but others were just suspected of being sick. Some had done nothing more than cough or sneeze in public. Some were guilty only of living in houses where the plague had struck, and all of them were being imprisoned with restraints you had created. The captain began bringing you increasingly disturbing requests. Cages small enough to hold children, chains designed to prevent any movement at all, iron masks to keep the sick from speaking or breathing on others. "The plague is getting worse," he explained when you hesitated to make the masks. "We think it might spread through the air people breathe out. These masks will protect the guards and make sure the infected can't pass their sickness to anyone else." You wanted to explain that the masks would just make it harder for sick people to breathe, that they would probably kill more people than they saved. But the guards were always watching, always ready to arrest you for treason if you refused an order. Sleep became impossible. Every night, you lay awake thinking about the people locked in chains you had forged, breathing through masks you had shaped, trapped in cages you had welded together. You imagined their suffering, their fear, their desperation. Some of them had been your customers, people who had trusted you to make tools that would improve their lives. Now those same hands that had created helpful implements were creating instruments of torture and imprisonment. You felt like you were losing your mind, caught between the guilt of what you had done and the impossibility of stopping what you were being forced to do. The breaking point came when they brought you a special order, a set of tiny shekels designed specifically for children under 10 years old. "There are some young ones showing symptoms," the captain explained coldly. "Can't risk them running around and infecting other children. These need to be small enough for their wrists and ankles, but strong enough that they can't break free." As you stared at the tiny iron bands, imagining them locked around the wrists of frightened children, something inside you finally snapped. You had become a creator of suffering, a builder of prisons, a smith who forged chains instead of freedom. And there seemed to be no way out, no escape from the terrible cycle of guilt and forced complicity that your life had become. After 3 weeks of being forced to make chains and cages for sick villagers, you couldn't take the guilt anymore. Every night, you lay awake thinking about the cursed iron that had started this nightmare. Where had it really come from? Who was that mysterious merchant who had sold it to your father for such a cheap price? You needed answers, even if finding them might put you in more danger. So one dark night, when the guards were sleeping and your father was too exhausted to notice, you snuck out of the workshop to follow the trail back to its source. The merchant had mentioned coming from the old mining roads to the north, the ones that led up into the mountains where people used to dig for iron and silver decades ago. Most of those mines had been abandoned for years because they'd run out of useful ore, but you remembered stories your grandfather used to tell about strange things happening in the deep tunnels. Stories about miners who went down healthy and came up sick, about veins of metal that seemed to move on their own, about sounds echoing from the depths that didn't sound quite human. The journey took you most of the night, following winding paths through thick forests and up rocky slopes. You carried only a small lantern and your lightest hammer, not sure what you might find, but knowing you needed some way to defend yourself. As you climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cold and thin, and you began to smell something strange, a metallic rotten odor that reminded you of blood mixed with sulfur. The smell got stronger as you approached the area where the old mines were supposed to be located. When you finally found the mine entrance, your heart nearly stopped. The opening was much larger than you'd expected, carved into the mountainside, like a giant mouth full of broken teeth. But that wasn't what scared you. What terrified you was the pile of bones scattered around the entrance, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, bleached white by years of weather, but still clearly recognizable as human remains. Skulls, rib cages, arm and leg bones, all mixed together in a horrible heap that spoke of death on a massive scale. You almost turned around and ran home right then, but something compelled you to keep going. Maybe it was the need to understand what you'd been working with, or maybe it was the hope that you might find some way to undo the curse that was killing your village. You lit your lantern and stepped carefully over the bones, trying not to think about how many people had died in this place. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, sloping downward at a steep angle. The walls were rough-hewn stone, but you could see veins of that same dark, strange-looking metal running through the rock like black blood vessels. As you descended deeper into the mine, the smell of death and decay grew stronger. Your lantern light danced across the walls, revealing more bones embedded in the rock itself, as if people had died and been absorbed by the mountain. You found broken mining tools scattered on the ground, pickaxes, shovels, hammers, all made of normal iron but corroded and twisted into unnatural shapes. Some of the tools looked like they had melted and reformed, while others appeared to have grown strange spikes or tendrils like living things. Then you saw the inscription, carved deep into the stone wall in Latin letters that seemed to glow faintly. In your lantern light, the message made your blood freeze. Here lies the curse of the black metals. Those who disturb this place bring death to all they touch. Turn back or join the army of the damned. Below the inscription was a crude drawing of a figure in a hooded cloak, the same mysterious merchant who had sold your father the cursed iron. But in this carving, the figure's face was visible, and it wasn't human. It was a skull, empty eye, sockets staring out with an expression of eternal hunger. You realized with growing horror that the merchant hadn't been a person at all. He had been something else, something that fed on death and suffering, something that had been waiting in this cursed mine for someone foolish enough to take his poisoned gift. The iron ore your father had bought wasn't just tainted. It was a weapon designed specifically to spread plague and misery wherever it was used. And you and your father had been the perfect victims, skilled blacksmiths who could turn the cursed metal into tools that would touch many lives. As this terrible understanding washed over you, you heard a sound echoing from deeper in the mine. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up from the depths, accompanied by a voice that you recognized with sick certainty. It was the merchant, and he was singing softly in a language that hurt your ears to hear. The same voice that had whispered instructions about making weapons with passion, with fire in your heart. You realized he was coming back, probably to check on the success of his evil plan, and you were trapped in his domain with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. 3 days after your terrifying discovery in the cursed mine, the hooded stranger returned to your workshop. But this time, everything was different. The soldiers who had been guarding you suddenly fell into a deep, unnatural sleep, slumping over their weapons as if they'd been struck by magic. The captain, who had been so stern and demanding, now sat motionless by the forge, his eyes open but seeing nothing. Even your father seemed to move in slow motion, his hands working mechanically at the anvil while his mind appeared to be somewhere far away. Only you remained fully aware as the cloaked figure glided through your workshop door. He moved without, making a sound, his feet barely touching the ground, and you noticed that he cast no shadow despite the bright flames of the forge. This time, you could see more of his face beneath the hood, pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, eyes that glowed with their own cold light, and when he smiled, you glimpsed teeth that were too long and too sharp to be human. "Greetings, young blacksmith," he said, and his voice echoed strangely, as if it was coming from somewhere very far away. "I see you've been busy," the creature continued, examining the chains and shackles scattered around your workshop. "Such beautiful work, such exquisite craftsmanship, every link perfect, every restraint designed to cause maximum despair. You've exceeded my expectations, Thomas." The way he said your name made your skin crawl, because you'd never told him what you were called. He knew things about you that no human stranger should know, and that knowledge felt like ice water in your veins. This time, he wanted something different from you. Instead of weapons or chains, he pulled out a piece of parchment with a detailed drawing on it. The image showed a crown unlike any you'd ever seen, not the simple circlet of gold that kings usually wore, but something twisted and organic-looking, with spires that curved like thorns and jewel settings that resembled eye sockets. "I need you to create this," he whispered, his cold breath making the flames of your forge flicker and dim. "Use the last of the special iron I gave you. Make it perfect. You tried to refuse, tried to tell him that you wouldn't make anything else with his cursed metal, but the words wouldn't come out of your mouth. It was as if your voice had been stolen, your will paralyzed by some dark power radiating from the creature. Your hands moved against your conscious desire, reaching for your tools, lighting the forge hotter than it had ever burned before. The Strange iron seemed to call to you, whispering promises of power and terrible secrets if only you would shape it one more time. As you worked on the crown, the creature told you a story that made your blood freeze. He wasn't just some demon or evil spirit. He was something much older and more dangerous. He had been the last king of an ancient civilization that had worshipped dark gods and practiced forbidden magic. When his kingdom fell, he had bound his soul to the cursed iron in the mines, waiting centuries for someone skilled enough to forge the items he needed to return to power. Every tool you've made, every weapon you've crafted, he explained, has been feeding death energy back to me, making me stronger. The crown you were creating wasn't just jewelry, it was a focusing device that would allow him to control every person who had been touched by your cursed creations. Everyone who had handled a tool, weapon, or chain made from his iron would become his slave, their minds controlled by the dark power flowing through the metal. Your village is just the beginning, he said with that terrible smile. Soon, armies will march carrying weapons you've forged. Kings will wear crowns of my making. The entire world will kneel before the power of the cursed iron. You realized, with growing horror, that he had planned everything from the very beginning. The cheap price for the iron, the mysterious orders for weapons, even your forced recruitment by the soldiers. It had all been orchestrated by this ancient evil. He had needed a skilled blacksmith to create the tools of his resurrection, and he had manipulated events to ensure you had no choice but to comply. Every strike of your hammer, every moment of pride in your craft, had been feeding his return to power. As you put the finishing touches on the crown, the creature began to change. His pale skin grew darker, his glowing eyes brighter, and shadows seemed to pour from his cloak like liquid darkness. When I place this crown upon my head, he whispered, every person in your village will become my servant. Then we'll move to the next town, and the next, until the entire kingdom bows before my throne. And you, dear Thomas, will be my chief weaponsmith, creating tools of domination for eternity. The crown was nearly finished, and with each passing moment, you could feel your last chance for resistance slipping away like sand through your fingers. Standing in your workshop, with the completed cursed crown in your hands, you felt the weight of an impossible choice settling on your shoulders like a heavy cloak. The ancient evil creature watched you with those glowing eyes, waiting for you to hand over the final piece of his plan for domination. Behind you, your father continued working in his magical trance, unaware that his son was about to make a decision that would change everything. The soldiers slept on, and the entire village remained trapped in the supernatural spell that had frozen time around your forge. You looked down at the crown you'd just finished creating. It was beautiful in a terrible way. The dark iron twisted into elegant curves, the thorn-like spires catching the firelight, the empty gem settings that seemed to stare back at you like hungry eyes. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a weapon more powerful than any sword or spear you'd ever made. In the hands of this creature, it would enslave thousands of innocent people, turning them into mindless servants of an ancient evil. Everyone you'd ever known, everyone you'd ever loved, would become puppets dancing to the tune of a dark master. But as you held the crown, another terrible realization struck you. This creature had been manipulating you from the very beginning. True, but he'd also been teaching you things about metalworking that no human blacksmith had ever known. The cursed iron had shown you secrets of the forge that your father and grandfather never could have imagined. You could feel the power flowing through the metal, understand the way it responded to heat and hammer in ways that defied natural law. You were no longer just a village blacksmith. You had become something more, something dangerous. The creature extended one pale, clawed hand toward you. "Give me the crown, Thomas," he whispered, and his voice carried the weight of absolute command. "Complete your masterpiece. Fulfill your destiny as the greatest blacksmith who ever lived." For a moment, you almost obeyed. The crown seemed to pull itself toward his outstretched fingers, and you felt your arms beginning to move without your permission. This was what you'd been working toward all your life, the creation of something truly magnificent, something that would be remembered forever. Then you thought about Henrik the baker, dead from touching knives you'd made. You thought about Mrs. Elena and her horse, about young Peter and all the other villagers who had suffered because of your cursed creations. You thought about the children who were now chained in those detention centers, wearing shackles you'd forged with your own hands, and you thought about what would happen to countless more innocent people if you handed over this crown. The weight of all that suffering crashed down on you like a falling mountain. "No," you said quietly, and the single word seemed to echo through the workshop like thunder. The creature's glowing eyes widened in surprise and rage. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice losing its hypnotic quality and becoming harsh and grating. You gripped the crown tighter, feeling the cursed metal burning cold against your palms. "I said no. I won't give this to you. I won't be responsible for enslaving the entire world." Your voice grew stronger with each word, fed by a growing fury at how you'd been used and manipulated. The creature's beautiful, terrible face twisted into an expression of pure hatred. "You foolish child," he snarled. "Do you think you have a choice in this matter? I am your master now. The cursed iron flows through your veins, connects your soul to mine. You will obey me whether you want to or not." He gestured with one clawed hand, and you felt a pulling sensation in your chest, as if something inside you was trying to tear itself free. But you held firm, anchoring yourself to thoughts of your family, your village, all the innocent people depending on you to make the right choice. Looking around your workshop, you saw 20 years of your life's work. Tools hung neatly on the walls, weapons displayed on wooden racks, examples of your finest craftsmanship arranged with pride. This place had been your sanctuary, your creative space, the foundation of your identity as a skilled artisan. But now, you understood that all of it was tainted. Every piece made with the cursed iron was a potential weapon in the hands of evil. Every tool could become an instrument of suffering. Your greatest achievements had become your greatest shame. You walked slowly to your anvil, the crown still clutched in your burning hands. Your father's hammer lay beside it, the same hammer he'd used to teach you the trade, the same one his father had passed down to him. 3 generations of honest blacksmiths had used this tool to create things that helped people, that made life better and easier. Now it was time to use it for destruction instead of creation. "If I can't stop you from existing," you said to the creature, "then I'll make sure you never get what you need to return to power." You raised the hammer high above your head and brought it down on the crown with all your strength. The cursed metal shrieked like a living thing as the hammer struck, sending sparks of black fire shooting across the workshop. The creature screamed in rage and pain, lunging toward you, but somehow the act of destroying his creation seemed to weaken him. His form became translucent, flickering like candlelight in a strong wind. "You don't understand what you're doing," he howled. "Without that crown, I cannot control the iron's power. It will consume everything, destroy everyone who has ever touched it." But you didn't stop. You struck the crown again and again, each blow sending shockwaves through the supernatural realm that had trapped your workshop. With every strike, more of your father's tools cracked and broke. With every impact, the flames in your forge grew wilder and more dangerous. You were destroying everything you'd ever worked for, everything you'd ever created, everything that had given your life meaning. But for the first time since the cursed iron had entered your life, you felt like you were doing the right thing. You were choosing destruction over domination, sacrifice over survival, the good of the world over your own desires and dreams. The moment your hammer struck the crown for the final time, everything changed. The cursed metal didn't just break, it exploded into 1,000 pieces of burning shrapnel that tore through your workshop like angry wasps. Each fragment that touched your skin left a mark that burned like ice, and you realized with growing horror that the creature had been telling the truth. Destroying the crown hadn't eliminated the curse, it had set it free, wild and uncontrolled. The dark power that had been contained within the metal was now spreading through everything it touched, including you. Your hands, which had held the crown as you destroyed it, were the worst affected. The skin turned black from your fingertips to your wrists, not with disease but with something far worse, a creeping darkness that seemed to eat away at your very life force. You could no longer feel your fingers, could barely move them, and when you tried to pick up your tools, they slipped from your grasp like water. The calluses you'd built up over years of honest work were gone, replaced by smooth, dead flesh that would never again hold a hammer with skill and confidence. The creature, weakened but not destroyed by your defiance, laughed bitterly as he began to fade away. "You think you've won," he wheezed, his form becoming more and more transparent with each passing moment. "But look around you, foolish boy. Look at what your noble sacrifice has cost." You turned to see your father, still trapped in his magical trance, slowly beginning to show the same black marks spreading up his arms. Every tool in the workshop was cracking and crumbling, every piece of iron turning to rust and dust before your eyes. Outside, you could hear screaming from the village. The wild curse was spreading faster than fire, touching everyone who had ever used one of your creations. But unlike the controlled plague that had killed people slowly, this unbound curse was consuming everything instantly. Houses were collapsing as nails and hinges disintegrated. Horses were crying in pain as their shoes burned their hooves. Farmers watched in horror as their plows and scythes turned to powder in their hands, leaving them with no way to work their fields or feed their families. You stumbled out of your workshop, your useless hands hanging at your sides, and saw the true scope of the disaster you'd unleashed. The village was dying, but not from disease this time, from the complete breakdown of everything made from metal. Without tools, without nails to hold buildings together, without horseshoes or wheels or any of the iron implements that made civilization possible, the people were helpless. Children cried as their parents tried desperately to hold together homes that were falling apart around them. The very foundations of daily life were crumbling to dust. The irony was unbearable. In trying to save everyone from slavery, you'd condemned them to a different kind of destruction. You'd taken away their chains, yes, but you'd also taken away everything else they needed to survive. The sick people who had been imprisoned in detention centers were suddenly free as their shackles dissolved, but now they had nowhere to go because their homes were collapsing. The soldiers who had forced you to work woke from their magical sleep to find their weapons and armor falling apart in their hands. Winter was coming, and without metal tools, the village couldn't prepare for it. No axes to cut firewood, no saws to repair damaged buildings, no nails to secure shutters against the cold winds. The harvest was rotting in the fields because all the scythes and sickles had turned to dust. Even if people wanted to flee to other towns, they couldn't. The horseshoes had disintegrated, leaving the animals unable to travel on rocky roads, and the wagon wheels were held together with iron bands that no longer existed. You tried to help, but what could a blacksmith do without the use of his hands? You attempted to give advice, to teach people how to make tools from wood and stone like their ancestors had done centuries ago. But your knowledge was all about metalworking, about shaping iron with heat and hammer. Without that expertise, you were just another helpless villager watching civilization collapse around him. The skills that had once made you valuable, that had made you essential, were now completely useless. Your father never recovered from the magical trance. The curse that had been unleashed when you destroyed the crown seemed to have burned out something vital inside his mind. He would sit for hours staring at his hands, opening and closing his fingers as if he expected to find tools there. Sometimes he would walk to where the anvil used to stand, before it crumbled into rust-colored powder, and mime the motions of hammering metal that wasn't there. The strong, confident blacksmith who had taught you everything about the trade was gone, replaced by a confused old man who lived in memories of better days. The guilt was overwhelming, but you couldn't even escape it through death. The curse that had marked your hands seemed to keep you alive when you should have starved, preserved you to witness the full consequences of your choice. You watched people grow thin and weak as food became scarce without proper tools to hunt or farm. You saw families huddled together in houses held up by nothing but hope and wooden pegs. You lived through the coldest winter in memory, seeing children freeze because there were no metal implements to cut enough firewood or build proper fires. Some nights, when the wind howled through the gaps in your damaged walls, you wondered if you'd made the right choice. Would it have been better to let the creature have his crown? Would slavery under an ancient evil have been worse than this slow death of an entire community? You'd saved the world from domination, but you doomed your own people to poverty and suffering. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than any hammer you'd ever lifted, harder to bear than any physical labor you'd ever performed. You'd become a blacksmith who could no longer smith, a protector who had brought destruction, a hero whose victory felt exactly like defeat. Months passed in the ruined village, and you learned to live with hunger as a constant companion. Your blackened, useless hands made even the simplest tasks nearly impossible. You couldn't hold a spoon properly, couldn't grip a cup without dropping. It couldn't even button your clothes without help. You wandered from house to house like a beggar, offering what little assistance you could provide with advice about makeshift repairs, but mostly just trying to find enough food to survive another day. The proud blacksmith who had once been essential to the community was now just another mouth to feed in a place where food was desperately scarce. It was during one of these wandering days that you first noticed something strange happening. You'd been staying in the old miller's house. His grinding wheel had disintegrated along with everything else made of metal, leaving him unable to work. His youngest daughter, Sarah, had been sick with a fever for weeks, one of the last lingering effects of the original plague that had started this whole nightmare. But on the morning after you'd spent the night under their roof, Sarah woke up completely healthy. Her fever was gone, her appetite had returned, and she was playing and laughing, like a normal child again. At first, you thought it was just coincidence. People recovered from illnesses all the time, and maybe Sarah's fever had simply run its course. But then it happened again at the next house, and the next. Wherever you spent the night, sick people seemed to get better. Old Henrik's wife, who had been bedridden with the same mysterious illness that had killed her husband, sat up and asked for breakfast the morning after you'd slept in their kitchen. A young farmer who had been coughing up blood for months suddenly found his lungs clear and strong after you'd sheltered in his barn during a rainstorm. You began to test this strange phenomenon deliberately, seeking out the sickest people in the village and asking if you could stay with them for a night or two. The results were always the same. Their symptoms would fade, their strength would return, and they would recover completely from ailments that had been slowly killing them. It was as if your presence somehow drew the poison out of their bodies, absorbing their sickness into yourself. But strangely, you never felt worse for it. If anything, helping others seemed to give you a sense of purpose that had been missing since you'd destroyed your forge. The villagers began to whisper about miracles, about divine intervention, about the mysterious healing power that seemed to follow the former blacksmith wherever he went. Some said it was God's reward for your sacrifice in destroying the cursed crown. Others believed that breaking the ancient evil's power had somehow transformed you into something holy, a living blessing that could undo the harm you had accidentally caused. You weren't sure what to believe, but you couldn't deny that something fundamental had changed inside you when you'd chosen to destroy your life's work rather than enable evil. Word of your healing abilities spread to neighboring villages, and soon people were making pilgrimages to see you. They came carrying sick children, supporting elderly relatives, leading blind horses and lame cattle, all hoping that your touch might cure what traditional medicine could not. You discovered that your power worked on animals too. Horses that had been injured when their iron shoes disintegrated could walk normally after spending time near you. Cows that had stopped giving milk because of the stress and chaos suddenly began producing again after you'd rested your marked hands on their flanks. The strangest part was that you seemed to be able to heal damage caused specifically by the cursed iron. People who still bore the black marks from touching your contaminated creations found their skin returning to normal after you placed your hands on them. The few survivors who had been imprisoned in the detention centers and still bore the scars from your chains watched in amazement as their wounds closed and their pain disappeared. It was as if the same dark power that had marked you for destruction was now flowing in reverse, undoing its own damage through your sacrifice. You began to understand that destroying the crown hadn't just released the curse, it had also broken the ancient evil's hold over you. By choosing to sacrifice everything you'd worked for rather than enable domination, you'd somehow turned the curse back on itself. The power that had been meant to enslave was now serving to heal. The iron that had been twisted to cause suffering was now, through your transformed touch, able to ease pain and restore health. Your ruined hands, which could no longer create tools or weapons, had gained the ability to repair something far more precious, human life itself. But with this new power came a terrible loneliness. You could heal others, but you couldn't heal yourself. Your hands remained blackened and numb, your connection to your beloved craft permanently severed. You could restore health to entire families, but you couldn't bring back your father's mind or rebuild your village's prosperity. You were like a doctor who could cure every disease except his own, a healer who remained forever wounded. The gift was magnificent, but the price was everything you had once been, everything you had once dreamed of becoming. Still, as you watched children play again instead of crying with fever, as you saw families reunited with loved ones you'd helped heal, you began to feel something you hadn't experienced since the nightmare began. Peace. Maybe this was what redemption looked like. Maybe this was how you paid for the harm you'd accidentally caused. Your skilled hands could no longer forge iron, but they could forge something better: hope, health, and second chances for people who had suffered because of your mistakes. It wasn't the life you'd planned, but perhaps it was the life you were meant to live. Years passed, and you grew old wandering from village to village, healing the sick wherever the road took you. Your hair turned white, your back bent with age, and your face became lined with the weight of all you'd seen and done. But your healing power never faded. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger as you aged, as if each act of kindness and each life you saved added to your ability to help others. You became known throughout the region as the Wandering Healer, though few people remembered that you'd once been a blacksmith, or that your gift had come from destroying a cursed crown. One autumn day, when the leaves were turning gold and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach, you found yourself walking through a forest that seemed familiar. After following a half-remembered path for hours, you emerged into a clearing where the ruins of your old village lay crumbling and overgrown with vines. Most of the buildings had collapsed completely, reclaimed by nature after decades of abandonment. But in the center of it all, like a broken tooth in an empty skull, stood the stone foundation of what had once been your family's workshop. You approached the ruins slowly, your heart heavy with memories. This was where it had all begun, where your father had first taught you to shape metal, where you'd created your first nail, where you'd worked with the cursed iron that had brought so much suffering. Weeds grew through cracks in the stone floor, and small trees had taken root where your anvil used to stand. Everything made of wood had rotted away long ago, and everything made of iron had crumbled to rust-colored dust that now fed the flowers blooming among the debris. But as you stood in the center of the ruined forge, something caught your eye. Half buried beneath fallen stones and decades of fallen leaves, a glint of metal reflected the afternoon sunlight. You knelt carefully, your old bones creaking in protest, and brushed away the dirt and debris. There, impossibly preserved after all these years, lay a single piece made from the cursed iron, an old sword that must have been hidden in some forgotten corner, overlooked when everything else had dissolved into nothingness. The sword was exactly as you remembered the cursed metal items, dark, cold to the touch, and radiating a sense of wrongness that made your skin crawl. Even after decades, you could feel the malevolent power pulsing through the blade like a slow, evil heartbeat. This was a piece of the original nightmare, a remnant of the ancient creature's power that had somehow survived when everything else crumbled. Just looking at it brought back memories of plague and death, of the terrible choice you'd made, of all the suffering that had followed. You knew what you had to do. Your hands might be too weak and damaged to hold a proper hammer anymore. But you still had one tool left, a small mason's hammer you carried for breaking up rocks when you needed to clear sleeping spaces on your travels. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. You picked up the cursed sword with your blackened fingers, feeling the familiar ice-cold burn that had marked the beginning of your transformation, and raised the little hammer with your other hand. The first blow rang out across the empty clearing like a bell tolling for the dead. Birds scattered from nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance you heard an echo that sounded almost like a scream of rage, the death cry of whatever remained of the ancient evil. You struck again, and again, each impact sending shockwaves through the supernatural realm that still connected you to the curse. With every blow, you felt a little more of the old darkness leaving the world, a little more of the poison being drawn out of the earth itself. As you worked, you began to hear something that made your heart skip, the sound of other hammers joining yours. Faint at first, then growing stronger, the rhythm of skilled blacksmiths working at their forges echoed through the clearing. You looked around but saw no one, yet the sounds continued. Your father's steady hammering, your grandfather's careful precision, and even your own younger self learning the trade for the first time. It was as if every honest blacksmith who had ever lived was helping you destroy this final piece of corruption. When the cursed sword finally shattered completely, the phantom hammering stopped, leaving only the natural sounds of the forest. You sat back on your heels, exhausted but somehow lighter than you'd felt in decades. The last physical remnant of the nightmare was gone, reduced to harmless powder that the wind quickly scattered among the autumn leaves. But as you prepared to leave this place forever, you heard something that made you smile, the distant sound of a hammer on anvil echoing from some unseen forge. You never found the source of that sound, though you searched the area thoroughly before continuing your journey. There was no workshop, no blacksmith, no explanation for the rhythmic hammering that seemed to drift through the forest on quiet nights. But travelers passing through the region began to report hearing it too. The ghost of a dedicated craftsman, still working at his forge, still creating something beautiful from raw metal, still practicing the honest trade that had once brought such pride and such sorrow to a young man who learned too late that even the most skilled hands can be used for evil purposes. You died on a cold winter morning, alone on the road between two villages you'd been traveling to heal the sick. Your old body simply gave out, worn down by decades of wandering and the constant burden of absorbing others' illnesses into yourself. A merchant found you the next day, sitting peacefully against a tree with your eyes closed and a small smile on your weathered face, looking more like someone taking a nap than someone who had passed from this world. He buried you there beside the road, marking your grave with a simple stone that read only "The Healer," because that's all anyone remembered you as. But death didn't bring you the rest you'd earned. Your spirit, still bound to the world by the unbreakable connection you'd forged when you chose sacrifice over surrender, couldn't move on while your work remained unfinished. There were still people suffering from the lingering effects of the cursed iron, still communities struggling to rebuild without the metal tools that civilization depended on. So instead of finding peace, you found yourself walking the same roads you'd traveled in life, an invisible presence bringing healing, wherever it was needed most. Your ghostly form appeared most often in places where metalwork was being attempted. Young blacksmiths struggling to learn their trade would suddenly find their hammers moving with supernatural skill, their metal heating more evenly, their finished products stronger and more beautiful than they'd ever managed before. Farmers, trying to forge simple tools from salvaged metal, would discover their work completed overnight, as if helpful hands had labored while they slept. But no one ever saw you. You were just a feeling of guidance, a whisper of encouragement, a mysterious improvement in the quality of their work. The old village where your family's workshop had stood became a place of pilgrimage for travelers who claimed to hear strange sounds on quiet nights. They would camp in the ruins, listening to the rhythmic hammering that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. Some said it was the sound of redemption being forged one blow at a time. Others believed it was the echo of all the good work that honest blacksmiths had ever done, somehow preserved in the stone foundations where generations of craftsmen had practiced their trade. Local children would dare each other to spend the night in the ruins, and those brave enough to do so always reported the same experience. They would hear the hammering start just after midnight, a steady, comforting rhythm that seemed to fill the darkness with warmth and safety. Sometimes they claimed to see sparks flying up toward the stars, tiny points of light that looked like fireflies but moved with the precision of metal being shaped by a master's hand. And in the morning, they would often find small gifts, a perfectly shaped nail, a tiny horseshoe, simple but beautiful objects that no living blacksmith had made. The sound of your phantom forge began to spread beyond the ruins of your village. Blacksmiths working late into the night in distant towns would hear an echo of hammering that seemed to come from their own workshops, even when they were alone. The rhythm would match their own work perfectly, as if an invisible partner was helping them with every project. Those who heard it found that their work improved dramatically. Their metals became stronger, their joints more secure, their finished products so beautiful that customers would travel for days just to buy from them. As decades passed, the legend of the ghostly blacksmith grew and changed with each telling. Some said you were the spirit of the first smith who ever learned to work iron, doomed to practice your craft for eternity. Others believed you were an angel sent to help honest workers who struggled to feed their families through the skill of their hands. A few claimed you were searching for something, a perfect piece of work that would finally allow your spirit to rest, but could never quite achieve the flawless creation that would set you free. Master blacksmiths began to teach their apprentices about the phantom sounds, explaining that hearing the ghost hammer was a sign of approval from the spirits of all the craftsmen who had come before. When you hear that echo, they would say, you know you're doing honest work, creating something that helps people instead of harming them. The ghost only hammers along with smiths who use their skills for good. And indeed, those who worked with evil intentions, forging weapons for bandits, creating tools for torture, making items meant to deceive or cheat, never heard the phantom sounds. The Catholic Church tried to investigate the phenomena, sending priests to bless the ruins and exorcise whatever spirit might be haunting the old forge. But their holy water and sacred words had no effect on the nightly hammering. If anything, the sounds seemed to grow stronger after their visits, as if your spirit was amused by their attempts to send you away. Eventually, the church declared that the phantom blacksmith was not a demon, but a blessed soul doing God's work, helping honest craftsmen and protecting the innocent from cursed metals. Even now, on the quietest nights in smithies around the world, blacksmiths working alone will sometimes hear it, the distant sound of a hammer striking an anvil, keeping perfect time with their own work. It's a reminder that the craft connects all workers across time and space, that every honest blow struck in service of helping others echoes through eternity. And somewhere in that sound is your story, the tale of a young man who learned too late that skill without wisdom can be dangerous, but who found redemption in choosing sacrifice over power, healing over harm, and the good of others over his own desires. The phantom hammer still rings out on winter nights, a sound that speaks of dedication, redemption, and the eternal struggle between creation and destruction that lives in every human heart.